Sup, and welcome to another installment of A Random Review. And in the previous video, I mentioned that there had not been a single critically acclaimed movie based on a video game for the first 40 to 50 years of video games being in the mainstream, basically since Pong came out. And what I neglected to mention was that includes the year that I'm recording from, the distant primitive year of 2022. As of March 2022, there has still yet to be a single movie based on a traditional video game that's not VR or not an app, that has not even been beloved, but just overwhelmingly liked. Not one video game movie has ever been certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. Again, as of the Jurassic pandemic-plagued year of 2022 that I'm speaking from. And it's really incredible. Like, you wouldn't have thought that it would be such a challenge for an industry to produce one truly great video game movie, especially considering how cinematic so many games have and had been for so long. But nevertheless, it's a streak that still exists, for me anyway. If you're watching this far enough in the future, I'm sure they've made plenty of great video game movies by now. And hopefully the world hasn't gotten irreparably worse since 2022, because, woo, that'd be bad. But regardless, because there had yet to be a great video game movie, when the Uncharted movie came out, I was like, you know what? I'm gonna go see this because if it's great, I'll be able to say that I was there for history, that I witnessed the first great video game movie ever in a theater. And that's why, when it came out, I went to see 2022's Uncharted, which was directed by Ruben Fleischer and was based on the popular video game series that debuted on the PlayStation 3 in 2007. So, unlike with Silent Hill, I was very familiar with the Uncharted games going into this. I had played the first game, Drake's Fortune, years before I saw this, and I thought it was great. It's one of those games that, when I played it, the thought actually came into my head, man, this would make a great movie, because it's very cinematic. It's about a treasure hunter named Nathan Drake, who's this suave, charming guy who searches for artifacts in the middle of jungles with his not-at-all trustworthy partner, Sully. Nathan Drake is basically the Indiana Jones of the video game world. And the thing with the Uncharted games is that they're one of these properties that's set up on a silver platter to be turned into a good movie. All the heavy lifting, the creation of the characters, the lore, the setting, and the mapping out of a story, all of that was figured out in the games. So to make a good movie out of it, all you have to do is take what's in the games and put it on screen. You don't have to make any major changes. It's right there for you. And yet, like so many video game adaptations before this, the people making this couldn't help themselves, because instead they went, yeah, but let's make some wholesale changes anyway. And they did. And the big change that they made is that the Nathan Drake in this movie has almost no resemblance to the Nathan Drake of the video games. He's a totally different person, outside of very cosmetic similarities. In the games, Nathan Drake is a suave, charming, grown-ass man who looks natural carrying a gun. He's the rare video game protagonist that you can totally envision settling down with a family in the very near future. He's as adult a video game hero as you're ever gonna find. But in this movie, Sony, the producers of this, decided to cast 25-year-old Tom Holland as Nathan Drake. And Tom Holland's most defining attribute, as of 2022, was that he looked really young. He was passing for a teenager in those MCU Spider-Man movies that came out right before this. So, for him to play Nathan Drake is jarring enough on its own, because he doesn't connote the video game character. But he doesn't act like him either. He's not suave, he's not charming, and in fact, he's not even all that likable. It would be one thing if they changed him and the changes they made were unique and inspired, because in a vacuum, there's nothing wrong with going in a different direction from the source material. But the direction they go in with him is a huge step down. In this movie, Nathan Drake is like a con man. He's a big pickpocket. He steals jewelry from people. And he's bratty. And he spends the entire movie whining and bickering to Sully. 70% of this movie is just banter. And so, when the movie becomes about him trying to find some lost treasure, I was not invested in his journey at all. I really didn't care if he found success or got rich or not. And it's not hard to figure out why Tom Holland was cast as this character, since who was Sony's biggest film property at the time? Spider-Man. And Uncharted came out right after the release of Spider-Man No Way Home. And it's easy to imagine Sony going into this and thinking, okay, we're gonna have our biggest bankable young star play the lead in this new property that we might not have that much confidence in. That way, we can at least ride the coattails of the new Spider-Man movie and make some money from it. And if Tom Holland doesn't fit the lead character, who cares? It's still the smart financial play. And you know what? It totally was, because this movie did very, very well at the box office. But that success came at the expense of this film's quality, because Tom Holland is totally miscast as this character. And it came across to me, when I saw this, that the reason Nathan Drake's personality is so different in this is because the people making this wanted him to resemble Tom Holland's Peter Parker character. This person acts way more like Peter Parker than Nathan Drake. It's like they wanted to trick people into thinking, subconsciously, that they were still watching a Spider-Man movie. And what sucks is that in order to make him more like Peter Parker, the filmmakers stripped away the aspects of Nathan Drake that made him cool and charming and endearing, and they replaced them with the annoying, angsty, superficial aspects of Tom Holland's Peter Parker character. And as a result, the Nathan Drake in this movie, I found almost impossible to root for. And it sucks, because had Sony simply made him more like his video game counterpart, both this character and this movie would have been so much better. But, you know, making the best movie possible doesn't always pay the bills, so c'est la vie. For what it's worth, I do think the film does a better job of conveying Sully from the games. Sully is also different in this, in that he's younger and a little less curmudgeonly than he is in the video games. But the film captures the most important element of his character, which is that he's a total snake and you can never tell what side he's on. He'll help you most of the time, but there's always an ulterior motive to what he's doing, and he will betray you in an instant if it's to his benefit. Which, if nothing else, keeps the film interesting, because you're always wondering, what's this dude's deal? Is he really helping Nathan Drake right now, or is this a trap? And I'm not the biggest fan of Mark Wahlberg, who plays him in this movie, but I thought he was actually fine in this. And the acting overall in Uncharted is alright for what it is. As for the story, this is again where the movie decides to drift away from the video games to its own detriment. When I think of the Uncharted games, I picture Nathan Drake scavenging in an Indiana Jones type setting in a jungle in the middle of nowhere. That's what Uncharted is to me. And yet, only the very end of this movie is set in an exotic, tropical setting like that. The vast majority of this movie takes place in cities, in metropolitan areas, and it's all about Nathan Drake and Sully finding clues for this treasure while being pursued by bad guys who also want the treasure. And the clues are scattered in parts of these cities where they're very close to people. They're practically hidden in plain sight. So, the movie has a big national treasure vibe, which, again, would be fine, except that the hunt for these clues winds up being incredibly anticlimactic. It turns out that one of the clues is in a big enclosing that's underneath a Papa John's, which of course is a wonderful excuse to insert some product placement into the film. And when I say that the enclosing is underneath a Papa John's, I don't mean like hundreds of feet below it. I mean directly under it, as in the sewer grate right next to this Papa John's leads straight to a gigantic catacomb that you're supposed to believe that no one has discovered for thousands of years, even though it is practically in the basement of this pizza place. And you're supposed to buy that the designers of this Papa John's very conveniently decided to build their store against the ancient surface of the catacomb that unlocks it without obscuring it in any way. But then, when the characters finally get to the big treasure that they've been searching for this whole time, it turns out that the treasure is in a cave on an island, but it's not even hidden in the cave. It's just sitting there in broad daylight, right next to the unobscured entrance that anyone could have gotten through this entire time. And again, you're supposed to buy that, oh, no one has laid eyes on this for hundreds of years. And you're like, come on, man. Like, there was almost no imagination put into the hunt for these treasure marks. In a better movie, in order to get to this cave, Tom Holland would have first had to go down a waterfall and escape a bunch of booby traps and solve a puzzle in under 30 seconds, or else the tunnel he was in would have squished him, and then he would have had to use the one and only key that would allow him to enter this cave. You know, those are things that would have made this exciting and dramatic. But instead, the movie was content to have the big treasure that everyone's been searching for be just right there in the end. Only a few hundred yards from the entrance. Nothing more complicated than that. No build-up necessary. And this was not an accident either. The reason Uncharted downplays the treasure hunting aspect from the video games, outside of a couple moments in the middle of the movie, was so that it could instead focus on the real thing that it wanted to be about: action. The treasure hunting in this movie is just a means to set up two gigantic action sequences that take place in mid-air in the second half of the movie. And those sequences are two of the most ridiculous, absurd fight sequences you will ever see. They're so absurd that while it's amusing to see the movie lose its mind and go all in with them, there's so little weight to what's happening in them, and they're flaunting the laws of physics so much that it doesn't leave much of an impact. I mean, sure, they're not boring, but they're so far removed from how this could possibly go down in real life that you can't not notice it. You're not nitpicking if you notice it. And so, as enjoyable as these sequences could have or should have been, the sheen of artificiality to them was so pronounced that I couldn't overlook it. This movie hadn't built up enough collateral for me to turn off my brain and just ride with them. They came so out of nowhere, and they felt so forced to me that they may as well have been airlifted in from another movie. It was as though the reason they're in this at all is because they had been mandated to be in this, and not because they actually deserved to be there. The other weird thing with Uncharted is that it couldn't figure out who it's supposed to be for. If you watch this, you'll see that for the most part, this is like the most PG movie of all time. The violence is very tame, outside of one shot of someone's neck being cut. The dialogue is generic dialogue that you've heard 1,000 times before. When Nathan Drake reads letters in this, there's always a voiceover reading them for you, so that you don't have to read what's on screen. The movie even has that comedy music that plays to let you know when something wacky is going on that PG movies sometimes have. You know, that music that's like... You know, that music. Uncharted, for the most part, was totally made for kids. In fact, if you told me that this was a Nickelodeon film, that this was something they put together for older teens or something, I would have believed it. And yet, despite all that, Uncharted is rated PG-13 because for some reason it has a ton of swearing in it. You hear the characters say the word shit like a dozen times, and this is not a puritanical complaint because obviously most kids can hear the word shit without bursting into flames or frothing at the mouth or whatever, but it doesn't fit with the rest of this movie, and it limits its audience. Like, let's say that you're the parent of a younger kid who's into video games, and you want to put on a movie for them, and you land on Uncharted. If you see that this movie is rated PG-13 and has a bizarre amount of profanity in it, that might be the difference between whether you'd put this on or not. And so, it's to its own detriment that this movie couldn't just settle on being a kid's movie. There's no reason why this had to have the same parental rating as Dune or the latest James Bond movie, other than the fact that the studio obviously just wanted to bring in as many potential ticket-goers as possible, and if that meant that the film was a bit mishmashed and is too mature to work as a kid's film and not mature enough to work as a typical PG-13 action film, then so be it. At least they got their money. To me, there are two types of movie adaptations. There are the adaptations that get made because the people making them genuinely had a vision for it and had a passion for the subject matter and really wanted to do something with it. And even if the movie is terrible, you can at least appreciate that an effort was made. And then there are the adaptations where you get the sense that the only reason they exist is because some studio head with dollar signs in their eyes demanded that it exist, just for the sake of it existing, and that they weren't all that invested in whether or not it was actually good. And that's what Uncharted comes off as to me. It has a couple fan-servicey moments in it. You hear the Uncharted theme pop in at one point, and you get to see a cameo that only people who've played the game would get. But otherwise, the spirit of the video games is missing from this. And that doesn't feel like that was an accident. If you watch this movie, you can just tell that this was made to coast off of Spider-Man. Like, even those big mid-air action scenes, they're totally something that you would expect to see in an MCU film. And yet, having said all that, I didn't hate this either. I didn't like it. There's not much about it that I thought was good. But it's not terrible in any way. It just kind of glides along, right in the middle. This is a thoroughly average, mediocre movie, which is why I will give it a rating befitting of that. I give the Uncharted movie from 2022 an underwhelming 4.88 out of 10, which means that no, it was not the first great video game movie ever. It's just good enough that you can watch it and maybe you'll like it, especially if you're dying for a light action movie or if you're really into video games. But deep down, even if you enjoy this, I think you'll also come away knowing that, yeah, there's nothing special here. Never mind as special as the video games.